Hello, my name's Amy. I have a lot to get through in my presentation today, so I hope that you enjoy it. The topic is drug and alcohol abuse in Indigenous communities. So the issue of drug and alcohol abuse, to outline it briefly, it's a widespread problem in Australia and it's not limited to just Aboriginals. There's a widespread drinking culture, and I would argue that the culture extends in places to recreational drug use, and that alcohol and drug abuse really negatively impacts individuals, families and communities. And the situation's more complex for Indigenous Australians due to the historical and contemporary issues that they face today. So why do people use drugs or alcohol? Mostly it's for fun, it's recreational, it's peer acceptance, and for other people it's a dependency. So people have been using drugs and alcohol for thousands of years, whether it be because the water wasn't safe to drink, such as in Europe, so they used to drink alcohols of various kinds, and there were various shamanistic rituals carried out through the use of drugs in different societies throughout history. The Australia's Department of Health approach uses Schaefer's model, and this categorises alcohol and drug use into one of two categories. I think it's a more holistic and harm reduction approach, and I do think it is better than the other models that exist. So this is the model. As you can see from the top level, the experimental drug use is at the top. It's also the widest, it's the most widespread. As we go down, the situations become slowly more complex and not so great, but then you also have less people doing it, hence why the pyramid model is a really good model. So basically, drug use and alcohol use is either recreational, so it's for curiosity, rebellion, being social, having fun, relaxing, or it's more compulsive. So that's when you start to get people using it to self-medicate, to cope with depression, anxiety, reducing a sense of alienation, or to mask a sense of no self-worth. That's when it becomes a really difficult thing to address. So substance abuse is really prevalent because any cycle of addiction, it doesn't matter if it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, shopping, they're really challenging to break. You've got a reward pathway in your brain that associates compulsion, you follow through with the action, and then your brain gets a little reward. And whether that turns into a negative experience, it can still be hard to break. So within Australia's drinking culture, many substance abuse can go unnoticed because it's so normalized, and many individuals don't even realize that they or people around them are actually affected by substance abuse. Alcohol consumption and drug abuse is also linked to coping mechanisms, as we just said before. So this is actually a really big problem in Western countries where alcohol advertising and social expectations around drinking are really prevalent. And exposure to drinking from a young age, or through advertising, through parents, friends, social expectations, any kind of behavior that's normalized for drinking or drug use, people are more likely to copy this behavior themselves. So what are the effects of drug and alcohol abuse? There is a spectrum of effects, and they range from mild to serious and even death. So alcohol and drug abuse has negative long and short-term effects on mental, emotional and physical health. It can result in things like exacerbating or developing depression, anxiety. It can develop cancers, cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease. There are many things that can go wrong from alcohol and drug use, especially over the long term. It has been proven that alcohol and drug use does increase rates of violence and crime in some communities. And if you look at the statistics in the Northern Territory, alcohol consumption was 40% higher than the rest of the nation, and for Indigenous Australians it was even higher than this again. And this actually aligns with higher incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians too in the Northern Territory. So who's most at risk? The Indigenous people? Not necessarily. Alcohol and drug abuse, any kind of addiction, it doesn't discriminate, and that's what makes it so challenging. So there are so many internal and external factors that impact the development of substance abuse that it makes it hard to predict who will and who won't suffer from this at some point in their lives. So internal factors include genetics, psychological conditions, personality, personal choice, and drinking history. External factors include family, environment, religion, social and cultural norms, age, education, and job status. I think that for Indigenous Australians in remote communities, they're at a higher risk of alcohol and drug abuse because a lot of these communities are government managed. They're not managed sustainably. There's low employment, low education, and there isn't really much opportunity for benefit there. And I think that's partly why we see a lot of these issues in these communities. So what's unique about the substance abuse for Indigenous people? Part of the issue is they have a shared community-based system, and this includes the sharing of alcohol and drugs. Historically, they've been subjected to the harsh regime since colonialisation, in which the loss of homeland, cultural identity, language, families, and just a whole sense of self-worth has created a huge distrust between two peoples and the Indigenous peoples and the government. So for them to reach out for help from the government, who has treated them so terribly for the last 200 years or so, they're not likely to reach out for help, and they're not likely to trust the government, and you can't blame them. In fact, one of the interesting things in the statistics show that Indigenous Australians are actually less likely to drink alcohol, but when they do drink, there is a tendency for them to go at higher levels than non-Indigenous Australians. Let's have a look. So here's some statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So if you look at the low risk drinking for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous for both males and females at the different levels, you will see that non-Indigenous people tend to drink alcohol at a low risk at a much higher rate. When we start to get to the risky behaviour and the high risk behaviour, that's when the numbers start to become much closer, and in some cases higher. And here it is again at the slightly older age group. You'll see it's a very similar pattern. The low risk, the non-Indigenous Australians are higher, and the high risk and risky tend to be higher by the Indigenous population. Here you've got substance abuse by gender for the Indigenous population. I think that you'll find that although the marijuana use is significantly higher, that it's probably not too far out of line with the rest of the non-Indigenous Australian population, because it is a very widely used drug despite being illicit. And here's another graph to demonstrate the acute risky and high risk alcohol consumption between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But graphs like this you have to be wary of, because it tends to highlight the bad things without giving you a full picture. So history, the issue of history. Colonialism has had a really negative impact on Indigenous populations. So they've had to deal with the stolen generations, the White Australia policy, the assimilation policy, segregation, racism, dispossession of land, culture, language, family and identity, and often unfair and very violent treatment. You know, we've just left them this legacy of disadvantage, and the wounds are still raw for many, you know. Imagine trying to be forced to adopt values and a lifestyle that goes against everything you were taught and everything you believe. You know, you can't just get over genocide, and that's part of the issue of the attitudes that Indigenous people face today, because it's seen as an issue of the past, but the wounds are still raw and the effects are still being felt. So what's the problem with the policies? The existing policies are often top-down, and they don't liaise with communities at the local level, and they don't address the root causes of the problem, and this is why there is so much failure. So in Western Australia, Indigenous Australians were reluctant to access treatment programs for alcohol and drug abuse, and many non-Indigenous healthcare workers found that they were faced with suspicious attitudes, anger, and violence, and you know, this created a problem for both sides. For the Northern Territory, high levels of incarceration and alcohol abuse were found to be the result of the effects of colonialism, the stolen generations, and other political interferences. The assimilation policy was a complete failure because they tried to force Indigenous people to adopt values and a culture that wasn't their own. And the intervention in the Northern Territory was a disaster because it didn't aim to solve the underlying issues of intergenerational welfare dependence, the unemployment rates, and the community measures to curb violence and substance abuse. You know, they just sent more police in, and basically that just led to more arrests without solving any issues. Created more. So what's the role of communities in this? Community attitudes affect the treatment and management of alcohol and drug abuse. Communities need to develop individual programs to address this, and they need to include education, rehabilitation, and access to health and support services. If you don't have these things, rehabilitation and management is not going to work. And that's the issue with a lot of remote communities. They don't have access to these things. You know, community attitudes also need to change. There's so many stereotypes about Aboriginal or Indigenous people being alcoholics or drug users or criminals. And if you look at certain cases like in the Northern Territory, you can see why stereotypes exist, but that doesn't mean that they're entirely true, you know. Having these stereotypes makes it harder for Indigenous people to make these changes, and we need to challenge these ideas that we have to help them move forward.